Hey there, everyone. Thanks for tuning in to another episode of the Caderna podcast. I'm your host, Brian Caderna. So today we're going to be featuring one of our special guests, who is none other than Andrew Parsons. If you don't know Andrew, you probably don't know too much about the whole podcasting industry. And I might be saying that with a bit of exaggeration because most of his work is behind the scenes. But today we're going to flip the tables as now he gets to field our questions and let us know what podcasting is all about. So, Andrew Parsons is an award winning audio producer and the executive producer of Prologue Projects. His shows, which we'll get into in a moment, have millions and millions of downloads. But first, Andrew got his start in audio while working as a New York City school teacher in 2007. He reported and produced an audio documentary about special education and the charter school system, and the rest is history. Since then, he's been the senior producer at the history podcast Backstory and co-created and produced the first two seasons of the Slate podcast Slow Burn. He's lectured and taught at his alma mater, the Columbia Graduate School of Journalism, and currently serves on the Google PRX Podcast Creator Advisory Committee. That's quite a mouthful there. So what's Andrew been up to lately, you ask? Well, he just completed the third season of Fiasco, which is now on the Luminary platform, about the Boston desegregation crisis of the 1970s, which just got a stellar review from the New Yorker. He also recently launched a podcast with Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist Tim Weiner about the history of the Russian and American covert espionage called Whirlwind, which sounds really cool. And simultaneously, they've begun a series on the Astros sign stealing scandal, hosted by the former Sports Illustrated journalist Ben Rader, who wrote the book Astroball and predicted their 2017 championship 3 years prior when they were still failing. That's all in addition to Andrew's normal work, which includes the Trevor Noah podcast, also on Luminary, and a weekly chat show about the Supreme Court. He's got plenty of other things in the hopper, certainly keeping busy, but he carved out an hour for us here today to field our questions. So without further ado, please help me welcome Andrew Parsons.
The Caderna Podcast. The Caderna Podcast.
The Caderna Podcast.
So Andrew, thanks for joining the show today.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, without a doubt. This was, as I'm just going through your bio and some of the emails that we had exchanged before, I was really pumped up about this because it seems like the world just can't get enough of podcasts right now.
Yeah, they seem to be the thing that like everyone is pivoting into. I think Hillary Clinton just released another podcast yesterday. Michelle Obama has one. It seems like everyone is just pivoting into that space.
Yeah, it kind of seems like if you don't have a podcast now, you're like behind the eight ball. And it's crazy because, I mean, I would say it was probably only 3 or 4 years ago, if that I even knew what a podcast was. And I even had like the little icon on my iPhone and I was like, what the heck is that microphone?
Yeah. I feel like it's been mainstream definitely like fairly recently. I think Serial, the podcast Serial, is known to be the first time that there was like a mega hit podcast back in 2013. And then the industry has just like exponentially grown ever since. Well, I shouldn't say exponential. That's like, but it has like grown very rapidly ever since.
Yeah, pretty close to it. And was that the first one that really kind of took the world by storm? Was Serial the one that kind of introduced podcasting to the world?
Yeah. Well, I think that's considered to be like the big one. My introduction into podcasts was a little bit earlier. I had like moved to New York City right out of college when I was in 2005, and my brother-in-law got me like what at the time seemed like an absolutely revolutionary iPod with like that wheel that turned. And I was a
Okay.
big public radio I was a big public radio listener. And a lot of the shows, Serial grew out of This American Life, and a lot of the shows that you could get on podcasts and sort of like take with you on the subway or as you got around were like primarily public radio shows like This American Life and Radiolab. I guess, more in like 2007. That's where I got to be like a huge podcast junkie. and eventually decided to try like making my own, probably in, I think, 2008 or so. 2007, 2008 was the first like attempts that I had to try to do audio documentary. And eventually I pivoted into journalism. But for me, like podcasts, a few years before, it was the back in when it was sort of like more of an urban phenomenon of, people on their iPods just walking around listening to these things. That's really what got me started into journalism and into the podcast space itself. But the funny thing was, like, my aspiration was to work at a public radio station. It wasn't to do podcasts. And then now we live in this flipped world where like people at public radio stations are trying to like break into, public radio stations are starting podcasts themselves, but people even in that space are trying to get into the companies more like ours.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it really kind of turned the whole industry, on its ear. So that's pretty cool. And so if you started in '07 or '08, that had to be, I imagine, like right at the forefront of, this whole project of building out podcasts. And was Joe Rogan like at the beginning? Because I know that's kind of the name you always associate, or at least that the circles I run in as far as podcasting. Is he just the most popular, or was he really at the beginning of it too?
That's a good question. I wonder, I'm gonna look that up right now. Like when the Joe Rogan podcast like experience started. Um because I remember hearing it or first getting like wind of it a little bit more recently.
Huh.
Um it was launched in 2009. So that it's more than
Okay.
a decade old at this point. I remember reading about Mark Maron as well in like 2011. People started doing sort of profiles on him, because he was like still doing all of his like interviews outside his garage. But yeah, I guess that was the time around like the the latter part of the last decade that a lot of people pivoted in. And
Yeah.
I sort of wonder how long it took him to monetize that as well.
That's
Because
the
now,
thing
like,
too. I always wonder.
yeah, I mean, clearly, like, he's, you know, probably the most, uh, probably getting the most revenue of any podcast. As
I
far
would
as like,
imagine. Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
as far
No.
as, like revenue share too. Uh,
Sure. Sure. And how does, if you can give us a little bit of insight to that as well, you hear about the deal that I guess he recently signed, not to spend too much time on another podcast of Rogan's, but the deal that he signed with Spotify, I've heard just obscene numbers of what went into that transaction. But is most of it just through sponsors that a lot of these folks are getting to kind of put on their show, or where does some of the monetary influence come into play with podcasting?
I think it all depends on the form of the podcast, and how much, money you're putting into it, on whether or not, and how big it is, whether or not like, ad revenue can balance your books. From our experience, there are like a few different models, and the best organizations are, I shouldn't say the best organizations, but a lot of podcast organizations and companies that do multiple podcasts are trying to balance a few different revenue streams. So ad revenue is one of them. I'd say that is the um, that's a great track if you're a comedian with like a big name, or an actor, someone with a name that can market themselves. They have a fan base already. They're gonna get a lot of initial ears on the project, so you can sell it from the get-go. You can sell it before it launches. And you can, if it's a conversation show, if it's a show, like this one where you're sitting down with someone, it's a two-way conversation that you can clean up and put out fairly quickly. I think you get the most out of revenue if that's the format.
Okay.
Whereas, I got the first big hit that I was a part of was Slow Burn, which is much more like Serial. It was an 8-part narrative podcast. We interviewed, I think, I forget which. See, we interview anywhere from 40 to 60 people per season. We put a ton of resources into it. Fiasco, which is the sort of what we're doing now, which is most like slow burn. We get custom score, from musicians and composers. Uh,
Wow.
we have to have a team of producers. And so that you're pouring a lot more into a product that only has like every 6 to 8 months, you're putting out like 8 episodes. And
Wow.
that, I think those are like, that's the pretty much the spectrum. And for that
Gotcha.
you need uh to be a little bit more creative. um for example, Fiasco is on the platform Luminary, and it is paywalled. So we've chosen to, you know uh make that deal to have fewer listeners on that podcast, but have sort of an upfront check from, Luminary Audible uh, can have a little bit deeper pockets, and can are trying to work with the model in which there's a little bit more of exchange of services from the listener, and it's not just ads. And then
Gotcha.
other
So that's something that listeners are actually paying and subscribing to listen to those shows.
Yeah, exactly. And the Trevor
Okay.
Noah podcast that we do is also through Luminary. But there's other things that get wrapped into podcast deals that you sign. One is also IP. We've yeah, I mean, we've when I was at Slow Burn, Slate sold that as a TV miniseries. And we've done the same with Fiasco. And so and lots of companies, one called Gimlet, that have done a lot of that. They did a fiction podcast called Homecoming that Amazon bought, and it was a Julia
Gotcha.
Roberts, video series. So that's another one. And then I'd say the fourth way that a lot of studios, my former employer Slate does this, as does like Gimlet, Pineapple Media, where they do these vanity podcasts sort of for corporations. And
Okay.
they have like a separate arm called like Slate Studios or Pineapple Studios or Gimlet Creative. And that is basically a company that goes to them with an idea for like a series that really, pushes their company profile. Gatorade, with a series of athlete interviews about how tough it is to get through, to push through sports and stuff. And that is, entirely promotional. There's no real, a lot of the people that I know that have been parts of those have real trouble with it because their background is journalism, and is like they have to do what the company says, and they can't like
Yep.
flex their journalism muscles. But though the price tag on those are much higher than it takes to produce them, and that
Huh.
revenue often covers some of the bigger risks and more creative projects that
Wow.
you're hoping are big once they land, but they're not always. It's a lot like a startup where you're taking certain risks on projects if it doesn't have that huge name next to it.
Yep.
And there's some companies that only do that only invest in the huge names because they know there's immediate revenue.
Got
So
it.
I would
Got it.
say
It's
like,
not as speculative.
yeah, the landscape's like pretty complicated. And then of course there's Patreon and self-funding things, and
There's
um,
so many avenues that you could go
yeah.
down with this.
Yeah,
Wow.
and a lot of places do combinations of those. Like Slate has Slate Studios, they've ads they sell, and they have a Slate Plus member program.
Okay. And now just to take a step back, and so we can get to know you a little bit more and how we got here. So if we rewind to 2007, you were a school teacher in the city?
Yeah, I did Teach for America in 2006. Uh,
Okay.
and so I was teaching first grade in a school in East New York, Brooklyn, a
Gotcha.
charter school there. Um,
And when you say you did an audio documentary about, special ed and about the charter schools, what exactly was that? That was just a documentary without a camera? Is that what that is?
yeah, basically. I mean, it's a little bit similar to like what you might hear on, on This American Life, or even the stuff that we're doing now. I basically had noticed that the school that I was in, well, I should say two things happened simultaneously. One, I was the summer in between my first and second year teaching. I was trying to figure out what I wanted to do. There's a car honk that went through. I'm
That's
not
all
sure
right.
if you heard it, but I'm gonna pick up. Two things happened the summer before, a summer in between my first and second year teaching. I was trying to figure out, where I was going. The first year was very, very difficult, as it is for a lot of teachers, and
Mhm.
that's why burnout is a big issue in teaching. And hats off to all the teachers that stick through. But I was talking to my sister, and she was visiting me in New York from California, and she had asked me if money wasn't an issue, what would I be doing? And I said I would probably be producing radio in some way, either public radio or documentaries or journalism. And she said, "Well, you should find out a way to do that." So I decided to like buy a microphone and recording kit and figure out how to do that. And there's a website that if anyone is interested um, in just audio gear, how to get. I know there's a ton right now, but back in 2007, there's only one, and it's called transom.org. It's a Peabody Award-winning website. Even back then, that is trying to democratize just the form of audio storytelling.
And that was transcend.org?
Transom.
A transom.
Yeah,
Okay.
and they have audio workshops. A lot of people involved in podcasts got their start going through one of their audio storytelling workshops up in Maine, and I just did what they told me. I got the equipment that they suggested on the website. There was only training at that point, and I think one audio editing software, though they have a bunch of different options now. And I just decided I was going to go and figure out how to tell stories. And simultaneously, what had been happening in my school was that there were uh, I don't want to get too much in the weeds with the way education is set up in New York City and what a charter school is,
Sure.
but a charter school generally is a publicly funded school that also gets private funding, and kids go in on a lottery system. So they often have smaller class size, and they're meant to try to sort of experiment with education and be another option within a community, another option for education within a community
Hmm.
that's not selective and still free and still gets public funds. But the issue that we were having at our school was because it was a lottery system and it was a smaller school. Uh, as far as special ed goes, you usually don't have enough children to make your own, like a separate special ed class that needs, and usually like someone depending on everything. Um, there might be children that need two teachers and only like 10 kids in the class, or only 8 kids in the class. And uh, we just didn't have enough kids in our school for that. And we had one kindergartner who was heavily autistic, and in a class of like 30 kids. And and this child would have been in, I think, probably a classroom with only 6 kids had they been in the traditional public school system.
Okay.
And the school was just tussling on what to do with it. The parent wanted him in that school because they believed that this charter school was better than the neighborhood schools, and particularly the special ed schools that were in that neighborhood. But the school just couldn't handle it, and it was like we'd have these meetings that between the teacher and our principal on sort of like what to do with this quandary. Do you go against the parents' wishes? Do you keep trying to integrate a kid into your classroom that needs more, even
That's a
though,
tough one.
yeah, and special ed kids have like a legal document called an IEP that determines what goals they're going to hit for the year. And it's a legal document that the school in particular couldn't even abide by. And I had the general question, like, is it that even legal? So I wanted to figure out like what those choices were that everyone was grappling with.
And
And a lot of the
that was the impetus to the first documentary.
yeah. I mean, it
Okay.
just was like a situation full of gray areas and full of like a,
Wow.
a lot of people trying to do their best with and the choices not being all that clear, which is tends to be a lot of the stuff that we drift towards in some of the topics that we choose when we're trying to like
Sure.
choose a new season of Fiasco, for example. So
And now,
uh,
did somebody notice that and say, "Hey, you got a knack for this thing," or was that the beginning of like your own journey of building out more documentaries or shows? Or I
yeah,
guess what was that next step?
that was just the beginning of my own journey. I spent a year doing that, and then I just started to interview as many people as I could and tried to play with how I could tell their stories. I mean, just like everything. Um,
Yeah.
from sorry, I'm getting a quick slack here, but like I even I I sort of did everything I could to the point of like putting Craigslist ads out, asking people to just like
Wow.
tell me their stories, and I'd meet up with them in public places and just talk to them for a couple hours and record them and figure out a way to narrate them to
That's
get
one way of meeting people.
yeah exactly to just friends of mine to there is a storytelling scene in New York City, like a live storytelling scene, and I would the main stage is a podcast called The Moth that's been around for a long time. But all of these storytellers would have their own little venues in which they would tell stories so that they can workshop and practice. So I offered to record them and send them the recording as long as I could use it in my podcast as well.
Hmm.
This is, back in 2008, 2009. Oh no, 2009, 2010.
So you
Um,
actually had your own podcast at that point.
Well, yeah, by 2009, I went with the goal of like launching a storytelling podcast. Um, and I did that in 2009. It was called Radio Waves. It does not exist anymore. And I just used it to, try to experiment as much as possible. And I tried to set a goal of getting something out the door, something in the feed every 2 weeks.
Okay.
And I was working alone, and I didn't have an editor or any. I would bug my friends for music to use because I didn't know if I could use just any music. So it was very much on the fly, but and it was all while I was teaching full time. But I just tried to set goals and just get better and try to do what I
That's
could.
awesome. That's
Uh,
great.
and and eventually I got overwhelmed with both endeavors and had to choose one.
Got it. And that's what I was going to ask you about, because I love that your sister mentioned that to you of, if money weren't an issue, what would you be doing right now? And I know a lot of people have posed that question. I think I actually first heard it from Timothy Ferriss, which was a show and
Mhm.
obviously some of his books that I've read. And he talks a lot about that, which I think is a lot of people struggle with that of kind of chasing their passion and also trying to be practical at the same time. And I think that's the beauty oftentimes when you're starting out your first career or you're still relatively young. Even like I could do as a financial advisor, building my own practice. I couldn't imagine having to redo it all if I was, 50 years old or something.
Yeah.
Um, so that's some of the beauty of youth, is to get to take some of those leaps of faith. And when did you actually take that, when you said, you know what, okay, I'm going to move on from teaching and pursue this radio slash podcasting world, full tilt?
It was 2000. I think it was the summer of 2010 or 11. I can't quite remember. I think 2010. Yeah, it only took about
Was that a
3 years.
scary move for you? Was that like
Yeah,
a
and
decision that
particularly
kept you up at night?
it did for a number of years actually. And
Okay.
that actually has to do with the financial aspect of it. I had saved a good amount of money, and believe it or not, as a school teacher in New York City, I'd made the smart choices to, not spend a lot on my living arrangements and have roommates and always take the smallest room without windows possible in an apartment. So I did have some money to take that leap with. At the time, if you wanted to do anything in public radio, it was unpaid internships. So that's what made it scary. I did several uh, unpaid internships while doing other jobs, like working in museums as an educator, like part time. Um, I in all the while I was applying to grad school as well, thinking that could be a good way to pivot to, and then I ended up going to grad school in 2011, only to find that like on your way out, the majority of things that people offer you coming out of grad school are more internships, and some of them are paid. And if they're paid low. So it all involved sort of taking on debt, probably more debt than I need to, and I wouldn't necessarily automatically recommend grad school for anyone going into journalism. I think a lot about whether I could have like toughed it out at the public radio station in New York City, um, which was hyper competitive. All the interns and all the temps are constantly vying for those full-time jobs. So it was scary, and it came at like a cost of both like the savings I'd saved up and debt that I accrued. And it's
Wow.
only now, like way later, when it's all worked out.
Yeah.
Um,
Did you
and
have any moments where you're like, you know what, screw this, I'm going back to teaching? Or was there ever that kind of, tug of war back and forth of what do we do?
uh, yeah, I mean, I think in my head that went back and forth for a while. I never didn't have work though. Was the thing. I was able to either have good temporary, in audio, um, in a lot of like creative industries, there's a lot of temp work. And
Yeah, it
there's a
seems
lot
like
of
so
like
much of it is
project
freelance.
based. Yeah, it's a lot of freelance, a lot of project based work. Um, and yeah, it's just whether or not you can like convert that into full time gigs. And so I always had work. I always had either temp or full time gigs. It was just whether or not they were like well paid or had visibility. And like I would say there's a few years where I felt I ended up. I'm back in New York City now, but I ended up even in like Charlottesville, Virginia, for a couple of years on that history podcast Backstory, in which it was in many ways I'm such a history junkie, and now like uh, have been on a couple of big history podcasts. But at the time it wasn't like it was a known podcast. It was on public radio stations in like Chicago and across the country, but it wasn't like a big show, and it was a small staff, and it was pretty exhausting. And I often thought like, oh man, I should just like become a teacher here. I have a master's in education, but then like I would look at the teaching salaries and realize they were either lower or not much different from what I was doing. Um, and I eventually went back to freelancing. That's where I actually worked on some shows that got big,
Got
and
it.
was able to convert that. But it wasn't. There's a period where all my capital just seemed to be lost, and I often think about what would have happened if I didn't have that right combination, particularly with Slow Burn. So Slow Burn was like a big hit show that I worked on that led to us forming our own company and led to Luminary offering us like a good contract, so that we could form a company and start doing other podcasts and be in demand. I often think about what would have happened if that all didn't line up. Because my student loans are paid off now, and I'm able to like buy a house and all of that stuff that's like really important,
Sure,
at
sure.
this point in my life. But I don't think any of that was guaranteed with that risk that I took.
No, it never is. I think that's the life of the entrepreneur right there. And even in our business where you're starting out and it's like, hey, there's a phone book, go find clients wherever you can. And it's like, that first year, every day you want to quit. The second year, it's like every other day you want to quit. And then eventually those moments of like, am I really made for this? They kind of become less and less often. And that's pretty cool. It sounds like you kind of went through that same trajectory that a lot of other business owners do.
Yeah. I guess I hadn't thought of it that way, but I guess in some ways that is what happened. Though, knowing the podcast landscape, I know that it doesn't. Uh, I I don't know the exact, necessarily how often it works out that way. If you're drawing like a real parallel to starting a business,
Yeah.
a lot of it was, it was just. I always say that any of those things are a combination of like timing, um, you know, who and then like the skills for when all of that happens at once.
Yeah.
And so, for a while, I was senior producer of that show Backstory, and I decided I'm going to freelance. You know, everyone that I once knew in radio in New York seems to be like, doing all these interesting things. And one of the first things I got turned into was supposed to be just like, a small mini series, history based mini series that ended up being pretty big. And Slate reached out to me for that to do Slow Burn. And because when I left, I decided to pass my name around and just let everyone know 3 months in advance when I announced I was going to leave, because I knew the show was going to have to do a national search, because there just wasn't a lot of readily available talent in Charlottesville. So we always had to do national searches to fill those positions. That I was just going to let as many people as I knew as possible, that I was going freelance. If they had any projects, send them my way. And it was like a grapevine of Slate reaching out and asking around to find people, because often those project-based things aren't posted. There are just a lot of people asking around. And then I think it was someone I knew in grad school that had mentioned that, like, oh, hey, that's History Podcast, this History guys, going freelance. And they reached out to me. So I had to be leaving my job at the right time. They had to have been sourcing for this project that was like particularly well suited to me. And then on top of that, you have to have the skills to pull off like a complicated audio documentary that like really makes people feel something. Um,
In this, what you're
all at the same
describing, that's
time.
your transition from Backstory over to Slate.
Yeah, exactly.
Got it. Got
And
it.
then I happened to be paired with like a host that had never hosted a podcast before, who was, and this is Leon Nafok, who was a Slow Burn, still hosts Fiasco, and he is my partner and runs the company that that we have right now. Who happens to just be like an immensely talented journalist and writer, and
That's great.
had
And
skills that could pair with mine well. But that's when you think back on it, that's an awful lot of things that have to happen all at once. And
yeah,
to
it's like a
be
whole series of coincidences that just
Yeah,
play in your favor, with hard work and a little bit of luck.
yeah. And that it
Yep.
came out at the time that people are hungry for it too. Like there's an audience.
Sure. And when you say like Backstory, for instance, it started out small and then it did much more than you thought it would. Like, just to give our listeners an idea, if they don't know that show, like what is it that, when you say it was big, what do you define big for us when you talk about a podcast?
Yeah, what you mean Slow Burn? Um yeah, they, without revealing, I know contractually I can't like really reveal any of Slate's numbers that they haven't revealed publicly, but generally a podcast that you can start selling ads on, I would say usually needs like, 30 to 40,000 listeners. I think there's some agencies that will start looking for some sponsors as low as like 25. It really depends on if you have like a core following that is like immovable and will always be there.
Yep.
Because there's some sort of smaller podcasts that are coming in around 20,000 that have just, they can do live shows. They have that 20,000 is so devout. And I would say most of and Backstory was around like 60 to 80 or so. So we were like selling ads on stuff, but like uh really big, I guess there are a couple tiers. There's some really big journalistic podcasts that like hit closer to like 500,000 or so.
Wow.
And Slate and Slow Burn blew up in more of those terms, crossing over. I don't know their numbers now, but crossing over into the million territory. Those are, those are, if you're over 200, 300,000 to a million, that's usually have a big show. And
Yeah.
I think
That's a nice
hit,
audience.
hit is also defined by like you're getting mentions in like the New York Times and Vulture, and like they have like a particular podcast reviewing outfit. Like even Fiasco doesn't have a ton of listeners because it's paywalled, but we still get, like, we had a great review in the New Yorker on our latest season. So I think buzz matters too, as far as like what a hit is. Like when you hear, I'd have friends tell me like, oh, I was listening to the Doughboys, which is like a comedy podcast on Earwolf, I think, about like food, reviewing like fast food, and they were mentioning they mentioned Slow Burn like offhand, like being like part of the conversation. I think matters a lot to that too, and that like helps grow your numbers. But I'd say that's sort of the range. And then there's like an even bigger tier of podcasts, which would go more into like the serial range, and Joe Rogan, which is like, you know, the, you know, many millions,
Yeah. Yeah.
when you're shooting above 3 to 7 million.
When you just kind of go viral. And where
Yeah.
where did a lot of that come from? Like some of your initial shows, whether it was Backstory, Slow Burn, do you find a lot of that traction just being spread through social media, or what kind of makes that go viral, for lack of a better term?
Yeah. Well, Backstory had the advantage of starting out as a public radio show. So I think some of their initial listeners were, people who had heard it on the radio. And then almost anything you can hear on the radio, you can find in podcasts too, if you don't want to like figure out what time it's playing every week. And then Slate has the advantage of being part of a network. They have like 20 some podcasts, so they can sort of create a small echo chamber among their listeners, and promote, not only promote their podcasts on other Slate podcasts, but do feed swaps. So the moment Slow Burn launched, it was in the first episode was in its own feed, but it was also in the feed for the Political Gabfest, which it was, I think, until that point, Slate's most successful show, which is still a very successful show from Slate. And also they're like, they have a Trump cast, a podcast like mostly all about the phenomenon like Donald Trump, and all their political ones. They have a Supreme Court podcast called Amicus, and it was put on there. So simultaneously you're getting a bunch of listeners from the get-go because you have that first episode in all these other feeds. And then from there, yeah, you're either seeking out advertising, selling. I don't, Slate didn't invest money into advertising because they didn't have to, but other podcasts will spend money up front. We ask that of anyone we partner with to have a marketing budget, and to like sell ads on other shows. Um,
Gotcha.
so yeah, there's a number of ways, and then you like actively just try to send emails to reviewers too and get them to
And
listen.
just promote it.
Yeah.
And so what's kind of like the structure of this whole thing? So I know you mentioned you went from a teacher to podcasting, you're doing freelance work. Right now, are you, or have you been, are you like a partner in one of these companies? Are you an employee of a company? Are you just a contractor to whatever kind of new show or idea piques your interest? Like, what is your, I guess, your employment status kind of along this journey?
Yeah. So, well, when we left, so I left Slate basically when Luminary approached Leon Nafok on like taking in starting the show like Slow Burn with them. Well, I shouldn't say with them, with with their money, because they don't produce any podcast. They the slate of Luminary shows, they fund podcasts as Luminary originals, but they don't hire anyone in. And so yeah, basically Leon decided to start this company, which we called Prologue projects, because we do a lot of history stuff, but not exclusively so. And recruited me in as executive producer, and basically, so he started the company. So I'm I would be considered like his right hand person in charge of like all the audio stuff. I'm executive producer as title, and like anything that we produce, I have stake in the IP, essentially. Um, and yeah, and I'm sort of full time overseeing uh, the slate of podcasts that we produce on a bunch of different levels. I would say most notably, I'm usually the last person that goes through everything, tightening it up, doing mixing, mastering, and having a really close ear. But it's also editorial work on Fiasco. Both Leon and I do a lot of reporting, because it's our sort of like anchor show, and he's the lead. He's the host of it, and it's the closest thing to Slow Burn, so we're still like heavily involved in it.
And
To
so,
to
and not
like,
to interrupt, but
yeah,
so is a lot of your work as like creating the content, or actually writing out the scripts or the shows, or uh,
yeah,
what's a normal day like in this type of job?
I'd say it really depends on the show. There are, I'd say in something like Fiasco, which is like a political documentary show, that we have a staff, but it's the show that we're like interviewing upwards of 60 people per season, so everyone needs to have a hand. And so I'm doing anything from like writing a script, to having a heavy hand in how archival sound and music is used, to like just making the schedule and making those decisions on who's going to be a lead writer and lead researcher and lead reporter on an episode, and structuring out when all our deadlines are, um, as we eke towards like a launch of one season. Usually takes about like 6 to 8 months to produce. um, so that's, you know uh, there's heavy involvement on a show like that. There are other shows in which we have a host and producer, and we're sort of more quality control. We're listening to their pitches on the season and giving feedback. We're listening to layups of episodes and giving feedback. We're making sure it's headed in the right direction, but it's a little bit more overview. If we hire a few new people to do a podcast, say that's like pegged to a book that's coming out, I'm taking the lead and setting everyone up with what they need to make sure they have equipment, and they are onboarded into our system, and have like a host of templates that I've built to make sure that everything's streamlined. So it's a real mix. And then sitting down and talking with Leon about some of the financial like issues that lay ahead. It's a little bit mix of all of that. And when coronavirus hit, it was trying to figure out how to get all of the shows recorded remotely, and what to do with our studio, that we pay rent on, but also
Yeah.
built so we could break it down and put it into storage. And writing guides to send to guests so they know how to record themselves.
Jeez.
All sorts of you know different levels of creation, but also heading up all the shows, like just making sure the infrastructure is there for us to do them efficiently.
That's pretty cool. And so, what are you working on right now? Like, what's the latest venture for you?
Well, we just finished up the third season of Fiasco, which was about the Boston desegregation crisis in the 1970s. It was a 7-part series um, that followed, the craziness that happened in Boston when they try to integrate their schools and bus kids from school to school. And ending a season just means we have to sort of regroup and figure out what our next seasons will be, which we haven't said publicly, but we've decided to start on season 4 and 5 at once, breaking up our team, and sort of trying to pursue 2 different subjects at once, and research and get all the interviews done from the get-go. And those are both things that won't be, launching till way into 2021. But there's a lot of scheduling, and figuring out, as far as like the team goes, how they're going to do that. But the stuff we have launching now are a podcast from the Pulitzer Prize winning writer Timothy Weiner called Whirlwind, and it's all about the history of CIA, and covert operations between Russia and the United States, particularly
That sounds
built,
interesting.
yeah, and it's particularly built around elections. And
Huh.
he's spent most of his career covering CIA, FBI, and a lot of the covert, behind the scenes things. And they're which, in one way it's, helping Tim learn how to become a podcast host, but the trade-off is he just has like amazing access to, we've like already interviewed, I think, 3 former CIA heads, and all of these former spies, both for the Kremlin and for the US. So that, I think the 3rd episode, there's 3 episodes out right now, and it's going to be a 10-part series.
And
And
that's called Whirlwind, that
yeah,
one?
Whirlwind.
That sounds awesome. I like that.
There's another one coming out in early October, so next week, called The Edge, and that's about the Astros sign stealing scandal in baseball. And that's hosted by Ben Ryder, who's a former Sports Illustrated reporter, who in 2014, when the Astros were the worst team in baseball, or I should say one of the worst teams in baseball. I'm not sure if they were the worst. He predicted on the cover of Sports Illustrated that they would win the 2017 World Series. And then they did. And he wrote the book Astro Ball about like their unique organization, how they actually did it. What he didn't realize was that they were also cheating. So this is a series, involving Ben sort of telling the story of how the Astros became the mega team they did, and how they built a culture that enabled that cheating, and sort of him also exploring how he could have possibly missed this story as well. And that's a 6-part series coming out next week. We're in the middle of the last, I think, 12 episodes of our season of the Trevor Noah podcast, which is on Luminary. But they do have a feed, if you just look up the Trevor Noah podcast, of some past episodes that's on Apple Podcasts and all other podcast feeds, if you just want to like hear what it's like. If
And
anyone,
these are totally separate shows. Each one of these that you listed that you're working on, they're just
yeah,
totally
yeah,
separate, but underneath your company Prologue.
yeah, absolutely. And we have another
Okay.
show on the Supreme Court called 5-4, which has a very particular perspective about the Supreme Court being both a political animal and absolutely terrible. And they pick apart decisions they think are like particularly bad.
Now, are
And
these some of your ideas, or are you guys vetting ideas that are brought to you and picking a show, or like where do all the original ideas come from?
it's a mix. Like that one was, I'd say Leon deciding that one person on Twitter he thought was like particularly funny and interesting, and like reaching out to him to see if he wanted to start a show. And then shopping it around. Because one thing, we're a small company that have that basically are only doing shows that someone else is funding. We haven't like, you normally start a company with a lot of like development money. But we had the unique position where like we just needed to start a company fast because Luminary was giving us money to do one show. So, the way we're building is a little bit piecemeal right now. But then we also get deals that, offers that are brought to us. And that was Whirlwind and The Edge were both brought to us as like shows that might be good fits with our aesthetic. And to see if we could just pull it together. So
That's
it's a
cool. That's
mix,
cool.
and there's definitely a couple. We have a slate of ideas that we're constantly working with, and that we have meetings on uh, things that we really want to get off the ground, and all the steps that we're working on in the background to make it happen, and to pitch it around as well. So it's a mixture. There are at least two or three, I'd say three other shows that are more passion projects that we've thought of that we're just trying to figure out how to get off the ground. And then there's a lot of stuff that is just brought to us as well.
And then, did you have like a favorite show or kind of experience that you could share with us along the way so far?
That we've done.
Yeah, that you've been directly involved with or kind of put your stamp on.
As far as at our company, I mean, I'm a, I mean, this is a little bit biased because this is all stuff that we're working on one way or another. But I think the edge is going to be really good. It's a really unique perspective. So like a really good inside perspective, of like a really big scandal, but also asking like really broad questions about like not only baseball culture, but the culture we live in as a whole. That I think, and it's just good storytelling. The characters are so amazing. Like if you can tell these stories through individuals, that are surprising and emotional, like they really hit. And because of that, I'm really proud of the most recent season of Fiasco as well, because I think it's a story of in of that crisis in Boston that's not really told. A lot of it reaches back into the 1960s, even though most of the most memorable years of violence were in the mid 70s. It really tells the long story and contextualizes everything that happened. And there's a lot of gray areas. There's just like, I love things where you walk out not really knowing how to feel. And I think that season does a really good job of doing that. Um,
That
but
one's called The Edge, that show?
well, there's The Edge, and then the third season, Fiasco.
Oh, got it.
About Boston, I'm really proud of as well. Oh, and we're actually just about to release outside of Luminary the first season of Fiasco, which was Bush v. Gore. Um, and that was basically, the uh, inside story of that legal battle that happened 20 years ago. And I think they've decided to put it outside the paywall just because it's the 20th anniversary, and the current election could go well beyond election day. And it's just one of those things that where I think there could be either lessons learned or just is a reminder that we've been there before.
Wow. Well, it sounds like you're keeping awfully busy, to say the least.
Yeah. I mean, I can't complain. It's
Good
a
for you.
really interesting industry to be in, and it's been a journey for sure.
What's next for you? Like, where do you see perhaps the industry going, and also you and your company? Like, if you had that 5-10 year plan, like what are some of those goals for the future?
Well, I think generally, as far as the goals for the future of the company, I think it's expanding our arsenal, but of podcasts, but also figuring out how to get investments that will allow us to experiment more. And which is a tall order, but I think that feels like the next step. I mean, in podcasting in general in the industry, I don't think there's anyone's fully figured out as far as like bigger companies are producing lots of stuff, um, like the perfect model. And I think the industry as a whole is going to experiment, and we're going to like need to watch and keep tabs on those experiments and see what applies to us. But then we also have to experiment ourselves. I think the more important thing is that we're doing stuff that we like and believe in as a concept. Um, and yeah, for me, the big question is like, what's going to enable that? In a lot of shops, what's enabled that is taking on a lot of corporate stuff, which we've been able to not do. And I think that's going to be a crossroads eventually. Like if you're going to be doing high touch, complicated storytelling that takes months and months and months, you're going to have to, that you want complete editorial control of, then you're going to, need to figure that out in the long run. So I don't really, uh, we know we want to expand our imprint as a company, but over the next 5-10 years. But a lot of this industry is sort of like having to learn and grow and keep an ear to the ground as you do it.
Certainly. So that's that was a lot of great information. I appreciate what you were able to share with us. And maybe one of the last things that we could touch on is, let's say that we have somebody and maybe they're at the beginning of the game, they've got their own small business or their passion and they want to create their own podcast, or perhaps a company that's more developed. Can you tell us, the avenues that either of those situations would pursue to try and create a great podcast? Like, where do they initially get started?
Um, well, I'd say you want to first think of how much you want to invest in it. I think on the very basic level of gear, you can go really expensive or you can go fairly cheap. I think you have to figure out, knowing that you're likely not going to get any return right away, what you're willing to invest. But there are like a ton of websites that have really good recommendations. And I already said transom.org is one of them. So definitely look into that. But on the other very basic, first steps I would take is to see, to figure out an elevator pitch for your idea and bounce it around your company or your friends and just see what their gut reactions are. If they're not that great, figure out if you're selling it wrong or if it's the wrong idea. You're also going to need to look around and see what other people are doing in your space, whether or not, especially if you're doing something to promote your company, whether you're better off just going on other people's podcasts and getting an audience that way, if everyone else is doing the exact same thing that you would be doing. But if you have something unique to offer, figure out what that is and then figure out the form it will take, whether it's storytelling, whether it's interview based, whether you want something done that involves lots of complicated archival work and music scores and things like that. um, figure out the best form that you can take to tell it. And then as you're trying out your whatever product you're coming up with, I tell everyone, and we do this with our own shows, with pretty much everyone but Trevor Noah, because his time is limited and he's enough of a pro that you don't have to pilot stuff. But everything else, if you're not a super famous and brilliant comedian, just pilot. Make sure that your first, maybe even your second episode is not going to see the light of day, and just get it on tape. Well, plan it, know the arc of what you're going to do, especially if it's conversational, and what you want to cover and where you want to land. Not to say you can't you can't explore things as well, but have a plan and then cut it to your best ability and put some ears on it. Get people's reactions, get their feedback, and go through the motions a couple times to get the kinks out, and do some research on how to interview. And the great thing about podcasting right now is that there are resources out there. So there's no need to rush into anything, especially if you're going to develop a fan base. You don't want to come out weak. You want to come out really strong. And that's going to take
Sure.
some work.
Got it. And just to piggyback on that, so people have a frame of reference. Obviously, you can start at the very ground level and kind of take a cheap route, if you will, or use some of the resources everybody has available. But then when we get into like a really, really top-notch show, like some of the ones that you're involved with, can you just share with us like a ballpark budget for some of these really top-notch productions?
Oh, that is endlessly debated in the industry.
Yeah,
And I'm serious because it's just a massive range. Because I think a lot of shows, and narrative shows in particular, try to get by with just a producer and a host and a very small budget. And that's a recipe for all-nighters. And then you can do a lot with a really big budget, but that's probably not gonna probably not gonna find that through any ad-supported means. So it's complicated, but the range that I've seen, and I don't say this facetiously, but it's anywhere between like $150,000 to $750,000. Like it just depends on how big of a team you want, and whether or not you can sort of be a little bit scrappy from the get-go. Like at Slate, we were super scrappy. It was just Leanne and I, and then like editors that they already had on staff. And we cut the most cut rate deals on archival and music that we could. But we also like worked really, really hard and pulled a lot of all-nighters,
Yeah, I
which is why
bet.
we were happy to get a team. But that's literally the range. It's and yeah, Leon, I think, posted on Twitter not that long ago asking what other people uh often budget for podcasts, and it's just the question was, do you want to make money off of it? And then when the answer is yes, it goes lower and lower. But I would say always bid for more of a moonshot. So if someone's asking you what you want for a an 8-part narrative podcast that's going to take months to produce and a lot of research and fact checking, and resources to get people on tape, don't give them anything less than 350,000.
Okay, good to know. That's I think that's pretty enlightening. So, anything else that that you might want to share with our listeners here, either about obviously the industry, which is booming, and like you said at the outset, growing it seems exponentially, or anything about your journey that you think, just to give you an idea, we have a very very broad audience, but I think the biggest niche is in the young professional space, with an interest in finance and business. Anything that you could perhaps share with us?
Um, Gosh, yeah, I'm not sure if there's anything I can say beyond that. I would say if you're, I'd say the most important thing is to, and I know this is hard in COVID times, but network and meet people and expand your horizons, because that's where opportunities happen.
Yeah. Yeah, I think networking opens a lot of doors, and I don't mean to belabor the point. I know we're here at the end, but for networking, a lot of your contacts and success that you've had, have you found that most of it has been kind of remote and over the web, and or are you actually going to different conferences or shows and meeting and shaking hands with these folks that you work with?
Well, right now it's definitely remote, and the conferences that I once went to are still remote, are now remote too. But in non-COVID times, yeah, there I think I'd say find the conferences you want to go to, because I there were audio conferences that I went to for years, and also just like listservs, and in New York City, a couple friends of mine like put together like monthly potluck in which people just got together and shared audio, and that they were working on, and people critiqued them. I think I actually hosted like the second or third, but it's been going on for 10 years. I haven't gone in many years, but that was big. Yeah, you meet a lot of people and you talk to them, and you hear about what they're doing. It's just super helpful. But then, as far as a great audio conference, I mean, the podcast movement, if you're in, is probably the widest span of material. It's everything from more conservative political to like health and wellness, to the like artsy podcast space. But then for a lot of the uh like the world I was coming from, which was like public radio and some really art, like uh audio documentaries and stuff, the Third Coast International Audio Documentary Festival every year in Chicago was like the most amazing thing to go to, because you can feel like pretty rundown in your career at times, and then you meet people doing great things, and you get excited about what you're doing again. And so, yeah, I can't recommend enough, especially once COVID times are over, to just get out there. And odds are there's a listserv somewhere, a Facebook page for what you're doing. And yeah, just connect with them and meet people.
Yep. Awesome. Well, thanks again, Andrew, for sharing all this information. I think it's been very eye-opening and also helpful for people that maybe want to start their own podcast or just even learn more about the industry. So thanks again for making some time and sharing your story with us today.
Yeah, totally. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, without a doubt. All right, everyone. Thanks again for tuning in to the Caderna podcast. I'm your host, Brian Caderna. Keep listening to us. We'll come out every week and we'll have something new to share with you as we try to pursue wealth in its original meaning, which is a state of well-being. And I'll let each and every one of you define that as you may. We'll see you next week.
Okay.
The Caderna podcast is for informational purposes only. Individual situations may vary, and the information should be relied upon only when coordinated with individual professional advice. Guardian and its subsidiaries do not provide tax, legal, Social Security, student loan, mortgage, or real estate advice. Listeners should contact their own tax, accounting, or legal advisors or the Social Security Department in this matter. All investments and investment strategies contain risk and may lose value. Brian Caderna is a registered representative and financial advisor of Park Avenue Securities, LLC, Pass, 300 Broadacres Drive, Suite 175, Bloomfield, New Jersey, 07003. Securities, product services, and advisory services are offered through Pass, a registered broker-dealer and investment advisor. 973-244-4420. Financial representative, the Guardian Life Insurance Company of America, Guardian, New York, New York. Pass is an indirect, wholly owned subsidiary of Guardian. Caderna Financial Team and International Planning Alliance, LLC, are not affiliates or subsidiaries of Pass or Guardian. Caderna Financial Team is a division of International Planning Alliance, LLC, a general agency of Guardian. Pass is a member of FINRA, SIPC. California Insurance License Number OK04194. Content of the Caderna podcast is copyright of Brian M. Caderna, all rights reserved. Any redistribution or reproduction of part or all of the content in any form is prohibited without prior permission from the Caderna podcast. The views and opinions expressed herein may not be those of Guardian Life Insurance Company of America, Guardian, or any of its subsidiaries or affiliates. Guardian does not verify and does not guarantee the accuracy or completeness of the information or opinions presented herein. Any third-party materials referenced cannot be endorsed or verified by Guardian and are used as the opinion of the author. Guardian, its subsidiaries, or affiliates do not provide or issue or advise for mortgages. This material contains the current opinions of the author, but not necessarily those of Guardian or its subsidiaries, and such opinions are subject to change without notice.